07:55 hours. June 4, 1942. 200 miles northwest of a speck of coral in the Central Pacific called Midway. A man in the cockpit of an obsolete torpedo bomber is doing arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic is telling him he is about to die. His name is John Charles Waldron. He is 41 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and he is leading 15 aircraft off the deck of the carrier Hornet toward the most powerful naval strike force on Earth. His planes are Douglas Devastators, torpedo bombers, already considered outdated when the war began. They lumber into their attack runs at barely more than 100 miles per hour. The torpedoes slung beneath them are known to run too deep, to circle, and very often to strike a target and simply fail to explode. Waldron knows all of this. He has spent months telling anyone who would listen exactly how bad his equipment is. But that is not the arithmetic troubling him this morning. The arithmetic troubling him is a compass heading. His entire air group has been ordered to fly one direction to find the Japanese carriers. Waldron is certain, with a certainty that goes all the way to the bone, that the direction is wrong. And when he tries to say so, over the radio, in front of the whole formation, the officer leading the strike tells him to hold his position and stay in line. So Waldron makes a decision that could end his career, land him in front of a court-martial, and brand his name with the ugliest word in the military vocabulary. He turns his 15 planes away from the formation. He disobeys a direct and lawful order. He flies off alone, toward an enemy nobody else can see, on nothing more than his own conviction about where they must be. Every single one of his aircraft will be shot down. 29 of the 30 men who follow him this morning will be dead within the hour. And here is the part that does not fit any simple story of a doomed and foolish charge. Waldron was right. He found them. And the disobedience that killed him and his men helped decide the most important naval battle in American history. This is the story of how one pilot, told to turn back, flew on instead, and changed everything. And it is also the story of a stranger question underneath it. Because for more than 80 years, the official record of what happened on the Hornet that morning did not quite add up. The numbers on the page did not match the memories of the men who flew. And when historians finally pulled that thread, they found something that looks a great deal like a cover-up. Let us start with the thing that should have been impossible, and work backward to why it was not. Consider what Waldron actually did, stripped of the drama, stated as plainly as a legal document. During a combat mission, in wartime, he received a direct order from a superior officer. The order was lawful. There was nothing improper about it. His commander had the authority to set the course, and he set it. Waldron acknowledged the order, argued against it, was overruled, and then deliberately refused to obey it. He took 15 aircraft and 30 men and led them away from the formation on his own authority. In military terms, that is not a small thing. Waldron had, at one point in his life, studied law. He understood the exact distinction between an order he was entitled to refuse and an order he was bound to follow. This was the second kind. If he had been wrong about where the enemy lay, and if by some miracle he had survived the day, the most likely outcome was a court-martial for disobedience in the face of the enemy. His career would have been finished. His name would have carried that stain for the rest of his life. Men do not usually take that risk. The entire structure of a military rests on the assumption that they will not. An order is followed, even when the man following it disagrees, because an armed force in which every officer flies his own private course is not an armed force at all. Waldron knew this better than most, and he broke it anyway. So the question is not simply whether he was brave. Plenty of brave men followed their orders that day and died flying in the wrong direction over empty water. The question is what could possibly make a disciplined, experienced, 41-year-old professional officer so certain of his own judgment that he would stake his life, his honor, and the lives of his men against the direct instruction of the man appointed to lead him. That certainty is the heart of this story, and it did not come from nowhere. To understand why Waldron was willing to do what he did, you have to understand what was at stake far beyond his 15 aircraft. Because Midway was not a skirmish, it was the hinge on which the entire Pacific War turned. In the spring of 1942, 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the strategic picture for the United States was grim. The Japanese offensive had rolled across the Pacific almost unchecked. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had fallen. A string of islands and bases from the coast of Asia to the approaches of Australia was in Japanese hands. The core of Japanese naval striking power was a fast carrier force known as the Kido Butai, the mobile force, and it had not yet lost a battle. It was, at that moment, arguably the most formidable naval formation on the planet. The Japanese plan for Midway was designed to finish the job that Pearl Harbor had started. By threatening the small American base at Midway, an atoll northwest of Hawaii, the Japanese hoped to lure what remained of the United States Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wanted the American carriers drawn out and sunk. If it worked, the United States might be forced to the negotiating table. The whole balance of the Pacific hung on the outcome. There was another layer to the danger, one that made the American position even more precarious than the map suggested. Only a month earlier, in May of 1942, the two navies had fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history in which the opposing ships never saw each other and every blow was struck by aircraft. The Americans had come out of it battered. One of their precious fleet carriers, the Lexington, had been lost. The Yorktown had been badly damaged, hurt so severely that by rights she should have been in the yard for months. The United States simply could not spare her. In an extraordinary feat, dock workers at Pearl Harbor patched the Yorktown back into fighting condition in a matter of days rather than months, and sent her out to Midway still bearing the scars of the last battle. America was going into the most important fight of the Pacific War with 3 carriers, one of them barely held together, against a Japanese force that had known nothing but victory. What the Japanese did not know was that American codebreakers had penetrated their naval cipher. The United States had a rough idea of the plan, the timing, and the target. This was the one great advantage the Americans held, and it was fragile, built entirely on the work of cryptographers reading fragments of the enemy's own messages. Admiral Chester Nimitz gambled everything on that intelligence. He positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush at a spot the Americans called Point Luck. The Japanese expected to spring a trap. Instead, they were flying into one. On the morning of June 4, the Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway itself, and in doing so, they exposed themselves. American search planes found the enemy fleet. The position, the course, the composition, all of it began flowing back to the American carriers. Now the counterpunch had to be thrown, and thrown fast, while the Japanese flight decks were busy recovering and rearming their own aircraft. This was the window. Catch the Kido Butai with its planes on deck, fueled and armed, and you could destroy it. Miss the window, and the most powerful carrier force in the world would come looking for you. That is the pressure Waldron was flying under. This was not a routine patrol. This was the single most important attack the United States Navy had launched in the entire war to that point, against an enemy that had never been beaten, in a battle that could decide whether America held the Pacific or lost it. Every squadron that launched that morning understood, at least in outline, that the stakes could not be higher. Which is exactly why the argument over the compass heading mattered so much. Get it right, and you might change the course of the war. Get it wrong, and you flew your squadron into empty ocean while history happened somewhere else. Now, to see why Waldron trusted his own answer over his commander's, you have to meet the man, because he was not an ordinary officer, and the men who flew with him knew it. John Waldron was born in 1900 in Fort Pierre, in what was then still very close to frontier country in South Dakota. He was of Sioux descent on his mother's side, and in the casual, rough way of the era, his fellow officers nicknamed him the Indian. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1924 and came to naval aviation with a reputation that followed him everywhere. He was intense. He was demanding. He was, by every account, obsessed with the craft of the torpedo attack in a way that struck some of his peers as excessive and struck his own men as something close to salvation. because it meant their skipper had thought harder about how to keep them alive than anyone else in the fleet. Waldron drilled Torpedo Squadron 8 relentlessly. He studied the enemy. He developed his own theories about navigation and attack geometry and the behavior of ships underway. He was known for an almost uncanny sense of direction, a feel for where things were on the featureless surface of the ocean that his men trusted completely. When Waldron said the enemy was in a particular place, the men of Torpedo 8 believed him, because he had earned that belief 1,000 times over in training. That belief was not a small thing, and it was not given lightly. A torpedo squadron in 1942 was a tight and particular kind of brotherhood. These were young men, most of them, pilots and radio men and gunners, and they had spent months together learning a craft that everyone around them privately suspected was close to suicidal in a modern war. They knew the Devastator was slow. They knew the torpedo was bad. What held them together was their skipper. Waldron was hard on them, exacting, forever demanding one more practice run, one more drill, one more repetition of the attack pattern until they could fly it in their sleep. But they understood why. Every extra hour he wrung out of them was an hour spent trying to tilt an impossible situation a fraction of a degree back in their favor. He was not drilling them out of vanity. He was drilling them because he believed, correctly, that skill and preparation were the only things standing between his men and certain death, and he intended to give them every scrap of both that he could. Men will follow a leader like that almost anywhere. As it turned out, they followed him to the bottom of the Pacific. He also had no illusions about what he was being asked to do, because he knew his equipment better than anyone. It is worth pausing on just how bad that equipment was, because it makes what these men did that morning almost unbearable to contemplate. The Douglas Devastator had been a modern aircraft once. When it entered service in the middle of the 1930s, it was one of the most advanced carrier planes in the world, an all-metal monoplane at a time when many navies still flew biplanes off their carriers. But aviation moved with terrible speed in those years. By 1942, the Devastator was a relic. Loaded with a torpedo, it wallowed through the air at little more than 100 miles per hour on its attack run. The Japanese Zero could fly nearly twice as fast. Against a modern fighter, a Devastator on a torpedo run was not a warplane so much as a slow, straight, predictable target that happened to have men inside it. And then there was the torpedo. The Mark 13 was, at that point in the war, one of the worst weapons the United States ever sent men to die carrying. It was riddled with defects that would not be fully understood or fixed for another 2 years. It tended to run deeper than it was set to run, passing harmlessly beneath the target. Its contact exploder was unreliable. Its internal machinery sometimes simply failed to start, so that the weapon splashed into the sea and sank without ever running at all. And it was fragile. To have any chance of working, it had to be dropped low and slow, from no more than about 50 feet of altitude and at no more than around 115 miles per hour. Drop it any higher or any faster, and it was likely to break apart or dive out of control when it hit the water. Think about what that requirement did to the men flying it. To deliver the torpedo, the pilot had to fly low, straight and slow, holding a steady course directly toward the target. Precisely the flight path that made him easiest to shoot down, and he had to do it in an aircraft that was already far too slow to survive. The weapon demanded that its crews fly into the guns as gently as possible. Later analysis of the Mark 13 would find that even in controlled tests, the great majority of the torpedoes dropped at combat speeds, failed in one way or another. The men of Torpedo 8 were being asked to fly obsolete aircraft, straight and level, into the most concentrated air defense on Earth, in order to deliver a weapon that would very likely not even work if they somehow lived long enough to drop it. Waldron knew every bit of this. It is precisely why he fought so hard, before the battle, over the other great question of the plan. He had argued that his slow and vulnerable torpedo planes needed close fighter protection to have any chance at all. He lost that argument too. The plan called for the fighters to fly high, to protect the dive bombers, and to bait the enemy fighters up to altitude, leaving the torpedo planes to come in low and alone. Waldron did not like it. He said so. And then, like a professional, He prepared to do it anyway. The night before the battle, he wrote a message to his squadron and had it distributed to every man. It has survived, and it tells you everything about who he was. He told his pilots that his greatest hope was that they would meet a favorable tactical situation. But if they did not, if the worst came to the worst, he wanted every man to do his utmost to destroy the enemy. And then the line that has echoed down through 80 years. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, he wrote, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. He closed it the way a man closes a letter he suspects is the last one. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give them hell. That is the man who about to be was told he was flying the wrong way, not a hothead, not a glory seeker, a meticulous, deadly serious professional who had spent his career learning to find ships on an empty sea, and who had just been handed a course he was certain would find nothing at all. To understand the argument that followed, you have to understand the man giving the order and the plan he was trying to execute. The officer leading the Hornet Air Group that morning was Commander Stanhope Ring. He was the air group commander, the man responsible for taking the ship's fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes to the enemy as a coordinated whole. And the plan he flew was built on a particular guess about where the enemy would be. Here is the problem that both men were trying to solve. The Japanese carriers had been sighted at a known position at a known time, but by the time the American planes launched, climbed, formed up, and flew out, an hour or more would pass. The enemy would not politely wait at the reported spot. They would move. So the real question was not where the Japanese had been, it was where they would be by the time the Hornets' planes arrived. That is a projection, a piece of dead reckoning built on assumptions about the enemy's speed and course. Ring, and the Hornets' commanding officer Mark Mitscher, settled on a westerly heading, a course of roughly 265 degrees. Their reasoning assumed the Japanese would continue driving toward Midway at a good clip, so the intercept lay well to the west. Waldron's arithmetic said otherwise. He reasoned that the Japanese carriers would not be steaming straight ahead at full speed. They would be turning into the wind to launch and recover aircraft, maneuvering, dealing with the American planes already harassing them from Midway. Their actual progress across the ocean would be far less than a simple straight-line assumption suggested. That meant the intercept lay more to the southwest, on a heading closer to 240 degrees. It was not a wild guess. It was a different, and, as it turned out, better model of how a carrier force actually behaves in the middle of a battle. And here is a detail that should have carried enormous weight. On the carrier Yorktown, the air group leadership worked the same problem, entirely independently, without knowing what Waldron thought. They arrived at essentially the same answer he did. They planned to fly more to the west and south, much closer to Waldron's heading than to Ring's. Two separate professionals, working alone, reached the same conclusion. The man who was overruled was not the outlier. In a very real sense, the formation flying the 265-degree course was the outlier. But rank does not bend to arithmetic, and Ring had the rank. Waldron made his case on the bridge before the launch. He was told to fly the ordered course. And so, when the Hornets air group roared off the deck between roughly 7 and 8 in the morning, Torpedo 8 went with them, flying the heading Waldron believed was wrong, holding formation, waiting to see who reality would favor. If stories like this one matter to you, the human decisions behind the great turning points of history, the arguments and gambles that the official summaries leave out, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach more people who care about getting it right. Now picture the formation in the air, because the geometry of it explains everything that happened next. The Hornet Air Group climbed away from the ship in layers. High up, around 20,000 feet, flew the dive bombers and the fighters. Far below them, close to the water, at around 1,500 feet, flew Waldron's torpedo planes. Nearly 3 vertical miles of empty air separated the top of the formation from the bottom. The torpedo planes had to fly low, because a torpedo attack is delivered at wave top height. The dive bombers had to fly high, because a dive bombing attack begins with a plunge from altitude. So the strike went out stacked, the slow, vulnerable torpedo planes crawling along just above the swells, while the rest of the group rode the thin, cold air far above. For a while, everyone flew the ordered course, west, into an empty quarter of the Pacific. And with every mile, Waldron's conviction hardened, because the ocean ahead stayed empty, and his own dead reckoning kept insisting that the enemy lay off to the left, to the south of the heading they were flying. About 15 minutes into the flight, he could not hold it any longer. He broke radio silence. Now, a word about what was said, because this is where legend and evidence blur, and honesty requires drawing the line clearly. Everyone that morning was supposed to be maintaining strict radio silence. Surprise was the whole point. So there is no official transcript of the exchange that followed. No recording, no verbatim log. What we have instead is the memory of the pilots who heard it crackle through their headsets, recollections gathered and pieced together many years later. The words that have come down to us are a reconstruction, an honest best effort assembled from several men's memories, not a court record. Keep that in mind as you hear them, because the uncertainty is part of the story. By those accounts, Waldron's voice came up on the net telling Ring, in effect, that they were flying the wrong direction for the Japanese carrier force. Ring, furious at the breach of radio discipline and furious at being challenged on an open channel in front of the entire command, snapped back that he was leading the flight and that Waldron would fly with the formation. Waldron insisted he knew where the enemy fleet was. Ring, angrier still, ordered him again to stay on the leader's wing and hold the formation. And then, according to the pilots who remembered it, Waldron delivered the line that has defined him ever since. Something to the effect of, "Well, the hell with you. I know where they are, and I am going to them." Whatever the exact words, the action is not in dispute, and the action is what matters. 3 miles below the rest of the group, Waldron banked his 15 torpedo planes away to the left, onto the southwesterly heading he trusted, and pulled his squadron off on its own. The formation split. Torpedo 8, slow and low and utterly without escort, flew off toward an enemy that existed only in the arithmetic in their commander's head, while the fighters and dive bombers droned on westward toward the empty sea. There was no going back from that. Waldron had committed. And in that moment he had done something that, had he lived, might have ended in a courtroom. He had led armed aircraft away from their assigned mission against a direct order from his superior in the presence of the enemy. In the coldest reading of military law, that is close to the gravest charge an officer can face. He did it anyway, on the strength of his own certainty, and flew toward the horizon. For a little under an hour, the two halves of the Hornet Air Group flew apart, diverging with every minute, and the arithmetic of the ocean decided which man had been right. Waldron found them. A little after 9 in the morning, roughly at 9:18, the low-flying torpedo planes of Torpedo 8 sighted the Kido Butai. They were the first American carrier squadron to lay eyes on the enemy fleet that day. Every other squadron in the air was still searching, still flying its assigned geometry, still hunting. Waldron, the man who had been ordered to hold the formation heading, had flown straight to the target as if he had been given a map. He tried to get a contact report out, to tell the American commanders exactly where the enemy lay. It appears the message was never received. And then, with the enemy carriers spread out before him and no fighter cover overhead, and no dive bombers arriving to split the defense, Waldron faced the last decision of his life. Wait, and hope the rest of the strike arrived to attack together as doctrine demanded. Or attack now, alone, into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft defense afloat and a swarm of the finest carrier fighters in the world. He attacked. There was a brutal logic to it. Waldron's whole purpose in flying was to put torpedoes into Japanese carriers. He had told his men that if only one plane was left, that plane should go in and get a hit. Waiting might mean losing the chance entirely. So Torpedo 8 bored in toward the carriers, dropping low, closing the range, 15 obsolete aircraft against a fleet. What happened next was not a battle, it was closer to an execution. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, 0 fighters, fast and nimble, and flown by superbly trained pilots, fell on the torpedo planes. The Devastators had almost no chance. They were slow. They flew straight and level on their attack runs, because that is how you aim a torpedo, which made them the easiest targets imaginable. One after another they were hit, caught fire, and fell into the sea. The anti-aircraft guns of the screening ships added their weight to the slaughter. The torpedo planes kept coming anyway, holding their runs, trying to get close enough to drop. Waldron himself was among them, out front, where he had always said a leader belonged. His plane was hit. The left fuel tank ruptured and caught fire. Witnesses saw him try to stand up in the burning cockpit, apparently attempting to get clear, before the aircraft nosed into the water, burned briefly on the surface, and was gone. His two wingmen were already down. The man who had defied his orders to find the enemy died within sight of it, having done exactly what he set out to do. One by one, the rest followed. The squadron was annihilated. Of the 30 men who had flown out with Waldron, 29 were killed. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Even if one had, the flawed Mark 13 might well have failed to explode. By any accounting a commander would recognize, Torpedo 8 had been wiped from existence for nothing. 15 aircraft gone, 30 families about to receive the worst news of their lives, and no damage to show for it. The sole survivor was an ensign named George Gay. His story deserves telling on its own, because he did not merely survive. He became, by pure and terrible chance, the only American eyewitness to watch the heart of the battle from the water's surface. Gay's plane was among the last of Torpedo 8 still flying. He pressed his attack through the swarming fighters and the anti-aircraft fire, and as he bored in on one of the Japanese carriers, he heard his gunner in the rear seat call out that he had been hit. Glancing back, Gay saw that the man was already dead. He flew on regardless, held his run, and released his torpedo at close range before his own aircraft was finally shot down into the sea. He had done exactly what his skipper asked. If only one plane was left, that man was to go in and get a hit. Gay was that man, and he went in. He crashed into the ocean and managed to pull himself free of the sinking wreck. And then he found himself alone, a single man treading water in the middle of the most powerful enemy fleet on Earth, with Japanese warships steaming past on every side. He grabbed a floating seat cushion and a rubber bag from his wrecked plane and used them to hide, keeping his head low, deflating the life raft that might have given him away, doing everything he could not to be spotted and machine-gunned in the water. And from that impossible vantage point, bobbing in the swells with warships all around him, George Gay watched the rest of the Battle of Midway happen. He was still in the water when the American dive bombers arrived. He looked up and saw them fall out of the sky onto the carriers he had just failed to sink. He watched those carriers take their fatal hits, watched them begin to burn, and watched the smoke pour up into the sky from the flight decks of the fleet that had just annihilated his squadron. A man who had lost every one of his friends that morning floated in the enemy's midst and saw the enemy destroyed, the whole reversal of the Pacific War unfolding in front of him at eye level. He would be in the water for some 30 hours, alone, before an American flying boat spotted him and pulled him out the next day. He alone came home to tell the squadron's story, and in the months that followed, he became, briefly, one of the most famous names in America, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8. Meanwhile, the men who had followed their orders were flying into a disaster of a different kind. Remember the rest of the Hornet Air Group, the fighters and dive bombers who held the ordered westerly course. They flew on, into an empty ocean, and found absolutely nothing. Ring led them west, toward an intercept that was not there, because the enemy had never been where the 265-degree heading assumed. The formations searched, the fuel gauges dropped, and slowly the mission unraveled into one of the most notorious failures in American naval aviation. An episode later, given a bleakly perfect name, The Flight to Nowhere. The fighters went first. The Wildcats escorting the strike began running low on fuel with no enemy in sight. Eventually they had no choice but to turn back toward the ship on a reciprocal course. They had waited too long. They had flown too far in the wrong direction. None of them made it home. Every one of the fighters ran out of fuel and ditched in the open sea. 2 of those pilots were lost. the escort that Waldron had begged for, and been denied, ended up going down into the Pacific without firing a shot in the battle, victims not of the enemy, but of a heading. The dive bombers fared little better. As the fuel situation grew critical, the formation came apart. Some of the dive bombers turned for Midway, gambling that the island was closer than the carrier. Others eventually groped their way back toward the Hornet. A number of them ran their tanks dry and went into the water. A large fraction of the Hornet's striking power, the very heart of the air group, contributed nothing whatsoever to the battle. It searched empty ocean, scattered, and came home in pieces, having never even glimpsed a Japanese ship. Sit with the contrast for a moment, because it is the whole point. The squadron that obeyed the order flew into nothing, accomplished nothing, and lost aircraft to empty fuel tanks over open sea. The squadron that disobeyed the order flew straight to the enemy and was destroyed attacking it. One of those outcomes looks like discipline, and one looks like mutiny. But only one of them put American aircraft over the Japanese carriers at the decisive hour. The neat moral of following orders, and the neat moral of heroic disobedience, do not survive contact with what actually happened. What happened was messier and far more interesting, because now we arrive at the hard question: did any of it matter? Was Torpedo 8's sacrifice, and the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons that came after it, simply a pointless slaughter, or did those doomed low-level attacks actually help win the battle? This is where the popular story and the careful history part ways, and getting it right matters more than any other fact in this account. For decades, the tale was told in a clean and satisfying shape. The torpedo squadrons, it was said, drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level to butcher them, and while the Zeros were down low finishing off the last of the torpedo planes, the American dive bombers arrived high overhead, unopposed, and plunged down onto carriers that had no fighter cover left to stop them. In this version, the torpedo pilots knowingly traded their lives to clear the sky, and their deaths bought the dive bombers their moment. It is a beautiful story. It is also too simple, and the best modern scholarship has taken it apart. Here is the more accurate picture. Torpedo 8 attacked at around 9:18 and was wiped out over the next 15 to 20 minutes. But the American dive bombers did not arrive over the carriers until after 10 o'clock. That is a gap of some 45 minutes. 45 minutes is far more than enough time for fast-climbing fighters like the Zero to regain altitude. The idea that Waldron's squadron alone pulled the enemy fighters down and simply left them stranded at sea level until the dive bombers showed up does not hold up against the clock. What actually happened was a cumulative effect, spread across 3 separate torpedo attacks, not one. After Waldron came Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, and after them came Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Wave after wave of slow torpedo planes bored in at wave top height, one group after another, over a stretch of roughly an hour. Each attack forced the Japanese carriers to turn hard, to comb the tracks of incoming torpedoes, to throw off their own flight operations. Each attack dragged the defending fighters down and kept them occupied, low and scattered, and burning fuel and ammunition. The Japanese were never given a chance to settle, to rearm their own strike, to get their attack off against the American carriers. So when the dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown finally arrived overhead, they found the enemy in a state of maximum vulnerability. The carriers were turning wildly, their fighters pulled out of position and down low by an hour of relentless torpedo attacks. And below their flight decks, in the hangars, aircraft were in the middle of being refueled and rearmed, fuel lines charged, and bombs and torpedoes not yet safely stowed. It is worth being careful here, because a famous post-war legend claimed the Japanese had a fully armed strike sitting on their flight decks just minutes from launching when the bombs hit. The best modern scholarship has shown that this was not true. The danger was not a ready deck load. It was the volatile chaos in the hangars below, open fuel and loose ordnance, at the exact moment the American bombs punched through. In a span of just a few minutes, American dive bombers fatally wounded 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The 4th, Hiryu, would be found and destroyed later that same day. The Kido Butai, the force that had not lost a battle, lost 4 fleet carriers in a single afternoon. It was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War for exactly this reason. Now, where does that leave Waldron and Torpedo 8? Not as the sole authors of the victory. That would be overclaiming, and the whole value of this account depends on not overclaiming. But not as a meaningless slaughter either. Torpedo 8 was the first American squadron to find and strike the enemy. It opened the assault. Its attack, and crucially the attacks that followed it, kept the Japanese off balance and their fighters low through the exact window when the dive bombers arrived. The doomed torpedo runs were part of the chain of pressure that set up the decisive blow. Waldron did not win Midway by himself, but he began the sequence that won it, and he did it by flying to a target the rest of his air group never found. There is even a small, strange twist in the geometry of the day. When Waldron peeled off and flew his own course, a group of fighters from the Enterprise, high above and out of radio contact, mistook his torpedo planes for their own and actually followed them for a time. Waldron, flying alone against orders, briefly and unknowingly led part of another carrier's air group toward the enemy. The man who broke formation was, for a few minutes, the only pilot in the sky who truly knew where he was going. Now let us go back into that cockpit, into the enemy's confusion, and then into a confusion of a very different kind, one that sat quietly inside the official record for decades. To understand the enemy's confusion, you have to understand the trap the Japanese commander had walked into, because the low-level torpedo attacks landed on him at the worst possible moment of a decision he was already agonizing over. The Japanese carriers had launched their first strike against Midway Island itself early that morning. Those planes came back needing to be recovered, refueled, and rearmed. At the same time, the Japanese admiral commanding the carrier force, Chuichi Nagumo, learned that American ships, including at least one carrier, were out there after all, closer than he had expected. Now he faced an impossible choice. His reserve aircraft were armed with weapons for attacking land targets. To strike the American ships, they had to be rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. That rearming took time, and it meant that for a critical stretch, his hangars were crowded with aircraft in the middle of being fueled and rearmed, with bombs and torpedoes and fuel lines exposed, the most dangerous possible state for a carrier to be in. Now imagine the battle from inside that dilemma. You are aboard a carrier of the Kido Butai. You have swept across the Pacific undefeated. Your fighters are among the best in the world, flown by veterans. Below your flight decks, in the hangars, aircraft are a frantic tangle of rearming and refueling. And all morning, groups of slow, obsolete American torpedo planes keep staggering toward you at wave-top height, with no fighter escort, into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and a swarm of Zeros. You shoot them down almost effortlessly, squadron after squadron, and you begin to feel something close to contempt, and perhaps relief. The Americans are throwing away their air crews in hopeless, uncoordinated attacks. Every one of those attacks, though, forces your carriers to turn hard and comb the torpedo tracks, which throws your own flight operations into chaos and delays the strike you are desperate to launch against the American ships. Your fighters, dragged down low again and again to slaughter the torpedo planes, are scattered and out of position, and then, out of the high sun, at the very moment your hangars are most vulnerable, thick with fuel and loose ordnance from the frantic rearming below, the American dive bombers fall. In the space of a few minutes your undefeated fleet is burning. The very attacks you dismissed as futile had held you in place, pulled your fighters down, and kept you from launching the blow that might have won the battle, until the blow you never saw coming arrived from above. That is the enemy's confusion, and it resolves cleanly enough with hindsight. But there is a second confusion in this story, and it does not sit on the Japanese side at all. It sits inside the American paperwork, and it took historians the better part of a lifetime to notice it. Here is the puzzle. Someone had to write the official report of what the Hornets Air Group did that day. That someone was the ship's commanding officer, Mark Mitscher. Now consider his position. His air group had, by any honest accounting, suffered a humiliating failure. The dive bombers and fighters had flown the wrong course and found nothing, ditching aircraft into the sea for no result. His torpedo squadron commander had openly defied orders on the radio, split off on his own, and been annihilated. And by the time Mitscher sat down to write his report, more than a week after the battle, he knew all of it. He knew the enemy had actually been more or less where Waldron said they were. He knew the ordered course had led to disaster, and he knew that if he reported the truth plainly, he might have to bring court-martial charges against his own dead and surviving officers for their conduct during the flight. What he wrote instead is the thing historians would puzzle over for generations. Mitscher's after-action report stated that the air group had flown a course that would have taken it toward the enemy. It gave a heading that pointed roughly where the Japanese actually were, a heading close to the 240 degrees Waldron had wanted, rather than the roughly 265-degree westerly course the group had in fact flown. On paper, the report made the disaster look like something closer to bad luck than bad navigation. It quietly smoothed over the split, the defiance, and the wrong turn. For years, that report was treated as the record, but it never quite matched the memories of the men who were there. Decades later, an investigator named Bowen Weisheit went looking for the truth, tracking down surviving pilots of the Hornet Air Group and asking them, one by one, what course they had actually flown. They had flown west, nearly due west, out toward empty ocean, not the southwesterly heading in the official report. When you laid their testimony against the paperwork did not survive. The implication is uncomfortable, and reputable historians have not shied away from it. The most straightforward reading is that Mitscher's report was not simply mistaken. It appears to have been shaped, deliberately, to conceal a navigational blunder and to protect the reputations of the men involved, including men who were now dead heroes. Reporting the full truth would have meant admitting that the air group commander led most of the strike the wrong way, that the torpedo commander defied him to fly the right way, and that the whole thing ended in ditched planes and annihilation. In the glow of the greatest victory in American naval history, that was not a story anyone wanted to file. There is a telling piece of supporting evidence. When Admiral Raymond Spruance forwarded the various reports up the chain, he took the unusual step of noting, in writing, that where the accounts from the Enterprise and the Hornet disagreed, the Enterprise version should be taken as the more accurate. That is a quiet but remarkable thing for an admiral to put on paper. It comes very close to saying, in the careful language of the service, that the Hornet's official report was not to be trusted. And notably, neither Ring nor his surviving squadron commanders filed the kind of detailed report that might have contradicted Mitscher's account. His version stood, nearly alone, as the record, which is precisely why it took so long to unravel. None of this is offered to smear any one man's memory. The point is subtler and more human than a simple accusation. In the aftermath of a battle that saved the Pacific, with heroes freshly dead and a stunning victory to celebrate, the institution reached, almost naturally, for the version of events that honored everyone and embarrassed no one. The messy truth, the argument, the disobedience, the wrong turn, was smoothed into something cleaner, and the man at the center of the mess, John Waldron, was quietly transformed from an officer who defied his orders into simply a fallen hero, which he also was. The disobedience that had actually mattered was the part most convenient to leave out, which raises a question the Navy is still wrestling with today, in our own time. If Waldron was right, and if what he did helped turn the battle, then what exactly did he earn for it? For his actions at Midway, John Waldron received the Navy Cross. It is the second highest award the naval service can bestow for valor, an extraordinary honor. The commanders of the other two torpedo squadrons that were slaughtered that morning, Eugene Lindsay of Torpedo 6 and Lance Massey of Torpedo 3, likewise received the Navy Cross. 3 squadron commanders, each of whom led his men into near certain death against the enemy fleet, each of whom helped fix the Kido Butai in place for the decisive blow, each of whom died doing it, the second highest medal for each. For more than 80 years, a small number of people have argued that the second highest medal was not enough, that what these three men did rose to the level of the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States can give. And in the last few years, that argument has gathered real force. A retired Marine officer named Thomas Richlick has spent more than a decade building the case. He first read the story of the Midway torpedo squadrons as a young man, in Walter Lord's classic account of the battle, and it never left him. In the years since, he has assembled evidence, filed records requests, and pressed the case through official channels. In 1981, an earlier attempt to secure the Medal of Honor for Waldron had failed, in part because it leaned too heavily on secondary accounts rather than hard documentation. Richlick set out to fix that. The road has not been smooth. In 2021, several members of Congress wrote to the Secretary of the Navy asking for a review of the case. The Navy's review board rejected the request, and did so, it later emerged, without even consulting the Navy's own historians at the Naval History and Heritage Command. When Richlick dug into how that decision had been reached, he found that the Navy had little documented basis for the rejection at all. Then came a genuine breakthrough. In August of 2025, Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command and the Navy's senior historian, wrote a letter that changed the footing of the whole debate. He stated that the three torpedo squadron commanders would likely have received the Medal of Honor had the full information been available to Admiral Nimitz and his staff back in 1942. He described the earlier reviews of the case as little more than a formality, and he recommended that the matter be sent forward to the Secretary of the Navy for a proper review. Think about what that means in light of everything you have just heard. Part of the reason the full information was not available in 1942 is that the official report of the Hornets' actions had smoothed over the very facts that make Waldron's conduct so remarkable. The disobedience, the correct navigation, the wrong turn taken by the rest of the group, the paperwork that protected reputations in the summer of 1942 may also have quietly capped the recognition its central figure could receive. The cover-up and the medal are not two separate stories. They are the same story, seen from two ends. As of the most recent reporting in 2026, the campaign is still unresolved. The evidence has been assembled. The Navy's top historian is on record. The case has support in Congress. But the Medal of Honor has not been awarded, and the matter remains under consideration. Whether John Waldron will finally receive, more than 80 years after his death, the nation's highest honor for the choice he made that morning, is a question still open as these words are written. It is a rare thing to tell a story from the deep past and know that its final chapter has not yet been decided. So what do we make of him, in the end? Not the legend, the man, and the choice. Strip away the mythology, the clean morals, the tidy version filed in the reports, and what remains is genuinely hard and genuinely important. John Waldron was handed a lawful order by a superior officer. He believed, on the strength of his own careful judgment, that the order was wrong in a way that would waste his squadron and squander a chance that might never come again. He argued, he was overruled, and then he made a choice that the entire logic of military discipline exists to prevent. He disobeyed, he flew his own course, and he took 30 men with him into an attack that killed all but one of them. If he had been wrong, we would remember him, if we remembered him at all, as a cautionary tale. A talented officer whose stubbornness got his men killed for nothing, who threw away his squadron because he could not accept being overruled. The line between the hero and the cautionary tale is not his courage, because both versions require exactly the same courage. The line is that he was right. The ocean happened to be arranged the way his arithmetic said it was. That is a deeply uncomfortable basis on which to judge a man, and it is worth being honest that it is the basis we are using. But there is something in Waldron's choice that survives even that discomfort. He did not disobey out of ego, as far as any evidence shows. He disobeyed because he had done the work. He had spent years learning to find ships on an empty sea. He had run the numbers that morning and run them again. Another air group, working alone, had reached his answer independently. He was not gambling on a hunch. He was staking everything on a conclusion he had earned the right to trust, against the judgment of a man who happened to outrank him. And when the moment came to choose between his discipline and his conviction, he chose the thing he believed would actually hurt the enemy, knowing precisely what it might cost him. The men who flew with him understood that, which is why they followed him without hesitation into a hopeless attack. They knew their skipper. They trusted his sense of where the enemy was more than they trusted the arrows on the operations plan. And in the end, they were proven right about him, at the cost of nearly all their lives. There is a strange and moving footnote to the story of Torpedo 8, one that shows how thin the line between survival and annihilation ran that summer. Not every man of the squadron flew from the Hornet that day. A detachment of Torpedo 8 had been left behind to take delivery of a brand new aircraft, the Grumman Avenger, the modern torpedo bomber that was meant to replace the doomed Devastator. That detachment reached Midway too, flying from the island itself rather than from a carrier. 6 of their new Avengers went out against the Japanese fleet on the morning of June 4. Only one came back, and it came back shot to pieces. So the men who carried the name of Torpedo 8 were gutted twice over in the same battle, once from the deck of the Hornet, and once from the island of Midway. The survivors of the shore detachment would carry the squadron's name onward through the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal in the months that followed. The squadron that was destroyed at Midway did not simply vanish. Its name flew on, carried by the handful of men the battle had spared. There is a final irony worth holding on to. Waldron's torpedoes never hit anything. His squadron, judged purely on its immediate mission, failed completely. Not one Japanese ship took damage from Torpedo 8. If you measured the attack by its own stated objective, it was a total loss. And yet the finding of the enemy, the fixing of the enemy, the relentless pressure that he began and others continued, all of it fed into a victory that changed the war. The mission failed. The disobedience succeeded. Those two facts lived together in the same hour, over the same patch of ocean, and any honest telling has to hold both of them at once. We opened with a man doing arithmetic in a cockpit, certain he was about to die, more certain still that his commander was flying the wrong way. Now you know how the arithmetic came out. He was right about the heading, and right about the enemy, and right about his own death. What he could not have known, in the minutes before the Zeros found him, was that the record of his defiance would be quietly rewritten within days, folded into a report designed to let everyone rest easy, or that, 80 years on, other men would still be fighting to pull the truth back out of that paperwork and put the right medal on his name. John Waldron was told to hold his course. He flew his own instead. He found the enemy that a fleet was hunting for, and he attacked it alone, and he died in the attempt, and the choice he made in defiance of his orders helped set up the destruction of the most powerful carrier force in the world. Whether the nation ever formally decides that this was worth its highest honor, the men who flew beside him settled the question for themselves in the last moments of their lives, when they looked at their skipper turning toward the enemy against orders, and turned to follow him without a word. If this account gave you something to think about, a truer and more complicated picture than the tidy version usually told, then a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the moments where history actually turned, and the human choices that turned it. Thank you for listening.